Hey, grab a Bible and meet me in Genesis 2 this morning. Genesis 2 is where we're going to start today as we finish our series, Below the Surface. We've been talking about the global pandemic that we've all been experiencing, but not the one everyone's talking about. In Doxology, we believe Jesus cares about the whole person, not just the 10% above the surface. So we've spent the last few weeks talking about mental health, anxiety, isolation, depression, and this morning we're talking about a huge one. Today we're talking about shame. I don't know if it's intentional or not, but sometimes Disney movies preach really great sermons. You ever notice this? Take, for example, what is inarguably the greatest Disney movie of all time, The Lion King. Remember how it starts? It's the circle of life, and it moves us all. And then we watch it happen, don't we? Baby's born, we meet the happy family, strong, majestic dad, precocious little naive, innocent kid who's born with purpose and promise and can't wait to throw off restraint and call his own shots. He just can't wait to be king. But then something bad happens to dad, and it's sad. Until the son meets two traveling evangelists who teach him to say some magic words. Remember what they are? Yeah, Hakuna Matata. Remember what they mean? No worries. For how long? For the rest of your days. And right then and there, Simba asks Pumbaa into his heart and lives happily ever after, just like us. Except he doesn't. Because that's not how the circle of life goes for any of us. Think back to that story again. Remember the moment that something bad happens to dad? You remember seeing that moment for the first time? Did you watch it with kids? You know, every kid who's really paying attention to that moment turned to their parents in that moment with a question, didn't they? And all the kids watching the movie are asking, why doesn't Mufasa get up? They sort of get ambushed with it, right? This isn't the way that stories are supposed to go. Why isn't he getting up? Oh man, that's an awful moment in the movie for the kids. You know what's awful too? The next moment, when you watch it with adult eyes. You remember that moment? It's so subtle. But if you're paying attention, it sort of kicks you in the gut. Remember what happens? Look, there were all kinds of forces at play in what happened to Mufasa. Many of them, maybe even most of them, completely independent of Simba, right? But not all of them. And there's this moment where it dawns on Simba that his part was one of the parts that had contributed to the bad and the sad in his world in ways he couldn't get back. And even if his wasn't the only part or the biggest part or the part that caused it all, even if his part wasn't all that was involved, it's all he can see. And you remember what he does in that moment? He runs. That's the moment. All the kids are asking, why didn't Mufasa get up? But I'm looking at Simba asking, why do I always run? Why am I always running? Think about Simba. It's not like he runs to the dark side, joins Team Scar, or becomes the worst animal in the animal kingdom. But in his shame, he finds himself living miles away from where and who he was supposed to be in a world that desperately needed him. That, friends, is the circle of life. And shame will move us all if we don't, or we won't, or we can't see the bigger story we were designed for and are still invited into. I've got you in Genesis 2. Let me do a little theology with you before we get to Genesis 2. Okay, Genesis 1 talks about God's design for His creation. Everything that's anything God created from nothing. The sun and the moon and the clouds and the mountains and the birds and the beasts and the people. And from the very beginning, God declares, Genesis 1, that people are distinct. They're different. They're made in His image. Remember Genesis 1, 26 and 27? Male and female, He created them. In His image, He created them. And then we've talked about this even recently. Immediately after He creates them, He commissions them to multiply and to spread out, to fill the earth, to go to work on the chaos outside of the garden, to extend paradise beyond the garden. From the very beginning, right? Really simply, that's the design and the purpose God gave to people. He sent us to show and to tell who He is and what He's like wherever we go on the earth from the very beginning. Genesis 2 goes back and zooms in on the creation of humankind to draw that out. And what you find is that God designed humankind to need not just Him, but to need each other too. So He created them out of the same stuff, right? There's similarity. But He created them different, male and female. Not just different, complementary, if you know what I mean. And it's literal, but it's also symbolic. It's about procreation, but it's about so much more than that. See, God's design depends on similarity, diversity, and unity, and vulnerability. That all has to be there if we're going to fulfill our purpose to extend flourishing outward, right? Not just about having babies. All those things are necessary to collaboration and to mission and to beauty and flourishing wherever we're sent from here. You see that? Okay, now we're ready now for Genesis 2, verse 25. It's the summary statement of everything we've read so far about God's creation and His commission of people. Look at verse 25. Adam and his wife were both naked, or as they say in Oklahoma, naked, and they felt no shame. Now think, that's sort of a weird thing to say at the end, isn't it? I mean, if we're just reading the story for the very first time, wouldn't you expect it to say Adam and his wife were both naked and they were both completely happy, especially Adam? That's not what it says. Why does it say no shame? Kurt Thompson wrote a book called The Soul of Shame that has really helped me think through this. And he points out something that I'd never seen before. Here's what he says, and I think he's right. This verse is not just describing the scene. It's also setting the stage. Remember, for chaos to be subdued and flourishing to expand, progress towards God's purpose in procreation, but not just in procreation, it's going to involve similarity, diversity, and unity, and vulnerability. All of it has to be there for it to work. And when you see that, you realize shame isn't just evil's attempt to make us feel bad about something we did. It becomes the primary battleground where the enemy, who shows up in the very next verse, tries to destroy God's purpose for His people and the world where we live. Just think about what happens after Genesis 2, verse 25. A lot of factors in play, right? Each of the characters in the story were involved in different ways to different degrees. But these beautiful, innocent, precocious, naive children, unaware of what their actions would cause, throw off restraint, do a little act of defiance, and it creates chaos, all kinds of collateral damage. It disconnects them from God. It disconnects from each other, and it detaches them from God's purpose for them to spread life to the rest of the world. They run and they hide. And I love that it was just a piece of fruit that did it. You know, in fact, Carrie and I were talking about this week. It's easy for some of us to say when it comes to shame, man, I'm not sure that shame is really a thing for me. Like, isn't shame just something that happens to people that have done really bad stuff? Like the super immoral stuff on your list, whatever that is? Notice, shame enters the human story not on a spring break trip that Adam and Eve took in high school and don't remember much of. Not on a secret abortion that she had that she never told anybody about. Not after an affair that one of them got away with, but couldn't ever get over. Shame often brings chaos into our stories, just like it rides into the story of humanity, on the back of something simple, like fruit. And you notice what happens to them if you know the rest of the story of Genesis 3. Rather than replacing chaos with flourishing, God's purpose, everything starts going in the opposite direction. They're literally covering over the image of God, blaming each other and disconnecting from each other and hiding from God as chaos comes into the garden. Look, they don't suddenly swear allegiance to the serpent and attempt to burn down the garden. They just go a little ways away from where and who they were designed to be in a world they were designed to engage. You see the strategy of the enemy here with shame? It's not just to make us feel bad. It's not even just to make us feel guilty. It's to convince us that we're ruined, that we're damaged, that we're worthless, that we're unlovable, or that we would be if anyone knew. So that we never really live where God placed us. We never really are who God made us, and we never really live into the purpose God has for us, to show and tell the world who He is. Instead, we run and we hide. What should we do instead? Well, flip over to John 21. Jesus shows us the way He deals with shame. John 21. You may know the story. Peter was Jesus' loudest follower who bailed on Jesus in His darkest moment. When Jesus was totally alone, afraid, suffering, Peter didn't come to His rescue like He promised He would. But it was even worse than that. He didn't go all the way away, just a little way away. He watched it all happen, and He did nothing to stop it. But it was even worse than that too. While Peter was watching Jesus suffer, a young girl walked up beside him near a charcoal fire. Remember charcoal fire. And this little girl says, "Hey, you're one of His followers." Peter said, "I get that all the time. Never met that guy." And she doubles down. So he doubles down. Then she triples down, and he does too. And just as he does, a rooster crows. And Jesus' blood-crusted eyes looked over toward that charcoal fire and directly into the eyes of Peter. A lot of other forces at work that night, weren't there? Many of them, most of them, completely independent of Peter. But not all of them. And at some point that night, it dawned on Peter that his part was one of the parts. He'd contributed to the chaos and the collateral damage in ways he would never get back. And you remember what he does? He runs. 3 days later, Jesus rises from the dead. He appears to the disciples in an upstairs room. The eyewitness accounts tell us Thomas wasn't there, but they don't say anything about Peter. He was probably right there in the room, hiding in plain sight, near Jesus, but not with Him. Near His friends, but not with them either. Trying to blend into the shadows, avoiding eye contact with Jesus, terrified that his secret is going to escape. And he lives there for 2 weeks. Peter shows up on the surface while the chaos rages below. Look what happens. John 21, beginning in verse 1. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to His disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them. And they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out. They got into the boat, But that night, they caught nothing. Peter says, I'm going fishing. Notice, this is what shame will do to us. It will always keep us locked into who we used to be, the way we used to live. Notice, Peter doesn't say, hey guys, I'm going robbing, I'm going pillaging, murdering. He says, I'm going fishing. He goes back to the familiar that Jesus had invited him out of. That's all the enemy needs, right? If he can keep Peter hiding, pretending, disengaging, the enemy doesn't need him murdering. The enemy's satisfied if Peter is just fishing, going to work, going home, hanging out on the surface with his buddies, coaching the kids' soccer team, running the school bake sale, showing up to synagogue, showing up for small group, all the things that he did before the bad and the sad and the chaos and the collateral damage. And yet you notice in the passage, literally below the surface, Peter's gone back to fishing. But fishing ain't working. Jesus stands on the shore. He says, hey boys, how's it going out there? They say, not awesome. Jesus says, try the other side of the boat. You'll catch some fish. Now, if you know their story really, really intentionally, really obviously, he's taken them back to the moment he called them and invited them into a bigger purpose for them. Fill the earth and subdue it. I'll make you fishers of men. Remember? And again, here, they haul in a whole mess of fish. Look at chapter 21, verse 7. Then the disciple who Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it's the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he'd taken it off, and jumped into the water. That is an awesome detail, isn't it? I mean, who does that? You get ready to jump in the water, you take clothes off, don't you? I mean, you don't put stuff on. Oh, we're going swimming. Hang on, I've only got a swimsuit on. I probably need a jacket before I jump in, right? Who does that? I do that. You do that. Some of you did that today, didn't you? The same thing Adam and Eve did. Whoa, God's over there in the garden. Man, I want to see him. But I can't let him see me. Not all of me. Peter throws on his fig leaves, jumps into the lake. And he gets to the shore where he starts to smell something. A charcoal fire is burning. You know, it's the second of 2 times this word shows up in the Bible. The first one, the night before Jesus was crucified. Peter gets there, Jesus has prepared breakfast. They all sit down. There in front of everyone. With the smell of charcoal burning in Peter's nose, Jesus says, Simon, son of John, doesn't call him Peter. He calls him by his full, formal family name. Not in anger, like my mom used to use my full, formal family name. Christopher Mark Freeland. I mean, you hear that echoing through the neighborhood. It's like, boys, I got to go. Like, I'm not sure what she discovered, but this might be it for me, you know? That's not what this is. This is tender. This is pursuit. This is wedding. Carrie looked in my eyes. She said, Christopher Mark Freeland. That's this. Jesus is saying, all of you, Peter, I'm talking to all of who you are, all of where you've come from, your past, what's happened to you, what was given to you, what's been inherited by you, what was done to you, and what you've done. Your whole story, Peter, and everything that it represents. Jesus says, Simon, son of John, I've got a question. Do you love me? I don't imagine that Peter makes eye contact, just smelling and staring at the fire. Peter says, yeah, I love you. Jesus says, feed my lambs. The most vulnerable animal in the herd, right? Jesus says right there at the start, I got a purpose for you that you're perfect for, Peter. And it's not hard to imagine Peter thinking in this moment, maybe he doesn't know? Maybe he doesn't remember? But Jesus asks again, and then again. Look at verse 17. The third time, he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. All things, Jesus. You know all things. You know about the thing I'm hiding. You know about the thing that I'm denying. You know about the thing I'm covering with this sopping wet coat I threw on before I jumped in the lake, Lord. You know all things. John says Peter was hurt. Why would Jesus do that? Do you see? When I was in college, I tore my ACL. It was painful. And the surgery after it was even more painful than the injury. But you understand, the surgery is the only way to be whole. Imagine if I'd gone to the doctor and said, hey, doc, tore my ACL. I know I'm going to need surgery, but I need you to stay away from my knee. Okay, I don't want to do an exam on the knee or surgery on the knee. Like, it's so tender and raw and swollen and ugly. Let's just avoid the knee altogether. But hey, I got a really good elbow. Like, let's talk about it. Maybe let's examine it, do a little surgery on it. Like, it doesn't really need as much. It won't hurt as much. That'd be crazy, right? You see what Jesus is doing with Peter? It's what he wants to do for you. Jesus brings the charcoal fire to Peter not just to make Peter relive the pain. He brought it up to relieve the pain. He's not exposing it to harm him. He's exposing it to heal him. And you notice Jesus restores him to relationships. Right there in front of all of those other knuckleheads. Thomas the doubter, Nathaniel the racist, James and John, the barroom brawlers. They've got their stuff, don't they? Right in front of them, Jesus declares, hey, Peter doesn't need to deny this anymore. He doesn't need to hide this anymore. He's going to stop running from here. I see it. I know about it. It does not define him in my eyes. It cannot define him in yours. And by the way, it can't define you in your eyes anymore either, Peter. That's important to say too, isn't it? I mean, sometimes we say, look, I'm good with what Jesus declares over me. I believe he's forgiven me. I just can't forgive myself. Can we talk about that for a second? Do you realize you never could? It's never been an option on the table for you. Nobody is allowed to serve as the judge and the defendant at their own trial. Pick a seat. You don't get to sit in both. You see that? You've never been in the position to forgive yourself. That's why Jesus stepped into position so he could. So the only thing that's left for you is the invitation that Jesus gives. It's to simply say this. To say, I agree with Jesus. How can I not? Because if he's inviting me to move forward from this and I'm refusing to move forward from here, I'm declaring that I'm a more just judge of justice than Jesus. I can't say that. And neither can you. Jesus looks at Peter with that same look. He's looking at when he looks at you. It's not the look of disgust. It's not the look of disappointment or revulsion or rejection. It's a look that says, look, I see your shame. I know what's below the surface there. It doesn't scare me. It's no match for me. In fact, let's take a look at it together. Because as soon as you face me, we can face it. And as soon as we face it, I will restore you back to relationship with me, into relationship with others, and toward a restored and redeemed purpose that you can't even imagine, but that your past makes you perfectly suited for. Jesus says to Peter, Peter, I can use this. I can still use you in a way that, believe it or not, will let you live out your purpose to show who I am like you never even could have before. Peter, you're going to be softer toward other vulnerable, shame-filled lambs around you than you were ever soft before. Remember what I told you that time the Pharisees outed that poor, ashamed woman at dinner, the one who has been forgiven much, loves much. Now that we faced this, Peter, you are in perfect position to love much. Not only are you going to be softer, Peter, you're going to be stronger too. Because if your secrets can't hide in the dark and threaten you anymore, what could you possibly fear? Peter, facing your past is the best way to keep it out of your future. And in fact, Jesus goes on to say that. He says, Peter, in the future, it's going to get harder, not easier to follow me. You're going to be pushed harder than you were and stretched further than you were around that charcoal fire. And you know what, Peter? You're not going to cave that time. Come on, Peter, let's leave the fire behind. Come on, it's chaos out there below the surface. And there are some people who need your story. Thomas, Nathaniel, James, John, your stories, they're similar, made out of the same stuff, but they're different. And if we go together, we can stay vulnerable. Just watch how paradise can spread. Happens almost every single week in Reengage here, in life recovery groups here, in conversations between alcoholics and their sponsors, every single week in community groups, and in conversations between neighbors. A person with a past meets a person with a present and is able to walk with them together toward the promise of Jesus in the future. And one little corner of chaos begins to flourish. What could happen in the chaos near you? You understand? The world needs your story too. All of it. The stakes are too high. Come on, for any of us to hide in the chaos below the surface. It's part of the reason that we did this series. Part of the reason that we did the series the way we did the series. You think there wasn't a voice from the enemy creating chaos in my world, talking about mental health, saying, just don't forget your fig leaves that morning. And if you talk about you'll lose their respect as a pastor. And they'll think you're a wuss as a man, Chris. Like they love you. They will not love you if you ever let them know you. But come on, you know already. It's not the way you responded to my story. It's not the way that Jesus will respond to your story. And it's not the way that people who are following Jesus will respond to your story either. Because that's how God made us and designed us to live from the very beginning, not to run, not to hide, not to disconnect, and not to settle for less than His purpose and His calling for our life in the open, in real life, wherever we're sent. Would you bow your head with me? Some of you in this moment, I can just imagine, are still saying, man, you don't know what I've done. There is no way Jesus could just dismiss what I've done like He did with Peter. Don't misunderstand this morning. That's not what Jesus did. Jesus didn't just dismiss it. He paid for it. And this morning He's saying, I see where you've been, and I went to the cross for that. I know what you did, and I buried it. I know what you're afraid of, And look, I conquered it. And I'm willing to set you free if you'll turn and look at me. Jesus is inviting you to trust him and to follow him. He placed you with your story at this point in the story, in this place in the story, because he has a purpose for you. Would you let him set you free today? If you're ready to go free this morning, you can just tell him in your own words right where you're at today. Jesus, I love you. I'm trusting that you died for me and rose from the dead and can forgive me and give me your life. And right here, right now, Jesus, I'll step down as the judge. I'll stop running and hiding. And it may look sloppy like Peter jumping into the water, but from here on out, Jesus, I agree with you. Let's spread paradise together. Father, would you make that our story? Would you redeem our stories and restore our stories? And let us have the courage and the strength and the presence of mind to share our stories right out in the open, wherever we go, so that in our world, in the various corners of chaos where we live, paradise would begin to spread. In the person, in the work, in the promise, and the power of Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.